In a quaint suburb nestled among rolling hills and dense woods, the Mullins family and the Higgins were known as pillars of the community. Mr. and Mrs. Mullins, along with their daughter Annabelle, lived in a picturesque house with a wraparound porch and a garden bursting with colorful blooms. Next door, the Higgins resided in an equally charming home, where Mr. and Mrs. Higgins raised their only child, Annabelle, who was the same age as the Mullins' daughter. Annabelle Higgins was a shy and reserved girl, often seen playing alone in her backyard or sketching quietly under the shade of a large oak tree. Despite living next door to each other, the two families rarely interacted beyond the occasional friendly wave or exchange of pleasantries. Annabelle Mullins, on the other hand, was outgoing and sociable, with a curiosity that often led her to explore the woods surrounding their neighborhood with her friends. As the years passed, the Mullins and Higgins families maintained a cordial but distant relationship. Mr. Mullins worked as a local historian, while Mrs. Mullins taught art at the nearby elementary school. The Higgins were known for their involvement in community events, with Mr. Higgins serving on the town council and Mrs. Higgins volunteering at the local library. One fateful summer evening, however, everything changed. It began with a scream that pierced the tranquility of the neighborhood. Neighbors rushed out of their homes, their faces etched with concern as they tried to pinpoint the source of the disturbance. It was coming from the Higgins residence. Mr. Mullins, who had been working in his study, hurried outside and ran towards the Higgins house. He was met by a scene of chaos. Police cars lined the street, their lights flashing ominously in the gathering dusk. Mrs. Mullins stood with a group of neighbors, clutching her daughter Annabelle tightly as they watched paramedics rush into the Higgins home. Rumors spread like wildfire through the neighborhood. Some whispered of a violent altercation, while others speculated about an accident gone awry. The truth, however, was far more chilling. Inside the Higgins house, police officers discovered a grisly scene. Mr. and Mrs. Higgins lay lifeless in their bedroom, their bodies covered in stab wounds. In the hallway, clutching a bloodied knife, stood Annabelle Higgins. Her eyes were wide with shock, her hands trembling uncontrollably as she stared at the officers in disbelief. "Drop the knife, Annabelle," one of the officers commanded, his voice stern yet tinged with concern. But Annabelle did not respond. Instead, she slowly turned towards them, her gaze fixed on something in the corner of the room. It was a doll unlike any they had ever seen before. Its porcelain face was frozen in a sinister grin, its glassy eyes seeming to glint with malevolence. As the officers cautiously approached Annabelle, she suddenly lunged towards the doll, clutching it to her chest protectively. "She made me do it," Annabelle whispered, her voice barely audible over the commotion. With a swift motion, one of the officers disarmed Annabelle and restrained her. Paramedics rushed in to tend to her wounds, but her eyes never left the doll cradled in her arms. It was as if she had been ensnared by its eerie presence, unable to break free from its grip. Outside, Mr. and Mrs. Mullins watched in horror as their neighbor's daughter was led away in handcuffs. Questions swirled through their minds, but one thing was certain: their peaceful neighborhood would never be the same again. Little did they know, the darkness that had taken root that summer evening was far from over. John and Mia Form stood in the dimly lit nursery of their small apartment, surrounded by baby clothes, toys, and a crib waiting for their first child. Mia was gently rubbing her belly, feeling the kicks of the baby growing inside her. John was unpacking boxes of gifts they had received at their baby shower earlier that day. Among the pile of presents was a beautifully wrapped box with a note attached. To John and Mia, with love and best wishes for your growing family. From Aunt Claire. John smiled as he read the note aloud to Mia. They were both excited to open the gift from John's eccentric Aunt Claire, known for her unique taste in antiques and collectibles. Carefully unwrapping the package, they discovered an old wooden box with intricate carvings and faded paint. John lifted the lid to reveal layers of delicate tissue paper. Nestled inside the box was a vintage doll, its porcelain face serene and its eyes wide open, staring up at them with an almost lifelike intensity. Mia gasped softly. "She's beautiful," she murmured, reaching out to gently touch the doll's delicate curls. The doll wore a quaint dress of lace and silk, and its hands were clasped together as if in prayer. John examined the doll closely, marveling at the craftsmanship and the attention to detail. Aunt Claire always did have an eye for these things, John remarked, his fingers tracing the doll's features. "I wonder how old she is." Mia nodded, a slight shiver running down her spine despite herself. "She's exquisite, but there's something almost unsettling about her, don't you think?" John chuckled softly, placing the doll back in its box. "Maybe it's just the idea of having a doll in the house again. Reminds me of my childhood." Mia smiled, feeling reassured by John's words. "Well, Annabelle," she said, addressing the doll with a teasing tone, "welcome to your new home." Little did John and Mia know, the arrival of Annabelle would set off a chain of events that would test their courage and their sanity in ways they could never have imagined. As the weeks passed, John and Mia settled into their routine of preparing for the baby's arrival. The nursery was transformed into a cozy haven, complete with a mobile of soft, tinkling bells and a rocking chair where Mia would spend hours imagining the future with their little one. Yet, despite the warmth and excitement that filled their home, there was an underlying tension that neither John nor Mia could quite shake off. Mia found herself waking up in the middle of the night, startled by strange noises she couldn't place. John, usually the voice of reason, began to notice subtle changes in their surroundings that left him feeling uneasy. One evening, as they sat down to dinner, Mia broached the subject that had been weighing on her mind. "John, have you noticed anything odd lately?" she asked hesitantly, twirling her fork in her pasta. John looked up from his plate, concern furrowing his brow. "Odd how?" Mia hesitated, trying to find the right words. "I don't know. It's probably just my imagination. But sometimes I feel like someone else is in the apartment with us." John's expression softened, and he reached across the table to take Mia's hand. "It's just nerves, Mia. We've got a lot on our plates right now with the baby coming and all. It's natural to feel a bit on edge." Mia nodded, trying to reassure herself with John's comforting words. "Maybe you're right. It's just, I can't shake this feeling." That night, Mia tossed and turned in bed, unable to shake the feeling of unease that had settled over her like a heavy blanket. As she finally drifted into an uneasy sleep, her dreams were filled with shadows and whispers. And the image of Annabelle's porcelain face staring at her from across the room. A few days later, Mia woke up to find John standing by the nursery window, his face pale and drawn in the early morning light. "John, what's wrong?" she asked, her voice thick with sleep. John turned to face her, his eyes haunted. "Mia, you need to see this." Confused and alarmed, Mia followed John into the nursery. Her breath caught in her throat as she took in the scene before her. The walls of the nursery were covered in strange symbols, drawn in what looked like charcoal or ash. Mia's heart pounded in her chest as she recognized some of the symbols from books she had read about ancient rituals and occult practices. "John, what is this?" Mia whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know," John replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "I woke up early this morning and found these everywhere. I checked the rest of the apartment, but it's only here." Mia felt a chill run down her spine as she stared at the symbols etched into the walls around her. There was an unmistakable sense of malevolence in the air, as if some unseen presence had invaded their sanctuary. "We have to call the police," Mia said finally, her voice steadier than she felt. This isn't right." John nodded, his jaw clenched with determination. "You're right. I'll call them now." As John dialed the emergency number, Mia walked over to the crib and picked up Annabelle, holding the doll close to her chest. Despite everything, Annabelle's porcelain face remained serene and unmoving, her painted lips curved into a faint smile. Mia couldn't shake the feeling that somehow, the arrival of Annabelle had unleashed forces beyond their understanding. As she clutched the doll tightly, she couldn't help but wonder if Aunt Claire had known more than she let on about the gift she had given them. Little did John and Mia know, the events that unfolded in the coming days would plunge them into a nightmare from which there would be no easy escape. The evil presence that had taken root in their home had its sights set on something far more precious than they could ever have imagined.
John's voice trembled as he spoke to the operator, explaining the strange occurrences and his growing fear for their safety. Meanwhile, Mia felt a chill run down her spine as she held Annabelle. The room seemed to darken, and a cold draft swirled around her. She remembered the cryptic warning Aunt Claire had given when she handed over the doll. "Take good care of Annabelle," she had said, her eyes clouded with a mix of sorrow and urgency. "She carries the weight of our family's past." John hung up the phone and turned to Mia. "They're sending someone over," he said, trying to sound reassuring, but the fear in his eyes betrayed him. Just then, a soft giggle echoed through the room. Mia's grip on Annabelle tightened as she and John exchanged terrified glances. The giggle was unmistakably that of a child, yet it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. "We need to get out of here," John urged, grabbing Mia's arm. But as they moved toward the door, a forceful gust slammed it shut. The windows rattled, and the lights flickered before plunging them into darkness.